The envelope had no return address, just my name, written like someone was trying not to wake the paper. Inside was a single sheet torn from a yellow legal pad, and taped to it, carefully, like a pressed flower, was a strip of gauze with a rust-brown stain. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I filed it. And that's how I helped them find the next one. I was 23 when I got hired at the Mason County Register in southern Illinois. It wasn't a dream job. It was a room that smelled like toner and burnt coffee, 5 people pretending the town still needed a newspaper, and a metal tray overflowing with mail we couldn't afford to answer. I'd just come back from a stint that didn't leave me with many options. The Register took me because I could type fast, show up sober, and didn't mind doing the work nobody wanted. Phone calls, obituaries, rewriting city council notes, and sorting the letters that came in from people who still believed ink could fix something. Most of it was harmless. A pastor asking us to run a bake sale flyer. A widow correcting the spelling on her husband's memorial. Someone furious about potholes. Every once in a while there'd be something off. A rambling manifesto. A prayer request that didn't feel like a prayer. But the first time I read the name Martha Keene, I felt the same thing I felt holding that stained gauze. A slow, sinking heaviness, like my body recognized trouble before my brain could explain it. Her handwriting was small and trembly, like it kept slipping. She wrote from a place called Briar Hollow, a dot of a community across the river in Kentucky, one of those areas where the roads curve so much you stop measuring distance in miles and start measuring it in patience. The letter opened politely, respectfully, the way people write when they're embarrassed to need help. She said she'd been a nurse years ago, back when her hands worked right. Now she used a walker, and her memory went soft in places. Neighbors brought groceries. A man named Calvin checked on her, dropped off vegetables, did small repairs. Then the letter swerved, not sharply, not like a scream, more like a car drifting into the wrong lane without the driver noticing. She wrote about a boy, a quiet boy who didn't go outside, a boy with injuries from an accident, who needed special care, and who stayed with her while his guardian worked long shifts. She didn't describe the boy the way people describe kids they love. She described him like a problem she couldn't solve with the tools she had left. She asked us to help find proper specialists. She said the guardian had training, medical schooling, but not the right equipment, not the right place, not the right support. And at the end, she invited us out. She wrote that she'd make tea, that we could see the boy ourselves, that we could do something good and that it would count. Those words, "it would count," sat in my head long after I folded the paper, because I'd read hundreds of letters from lonely people in rural towns, and none of them sounded like they were negotiating with something. I didn't tell my editor at first, not because I didn't care, because in a tiny paper like ours, you learn quickly which kinds of problems belong to you, and which kinds will swallow you whole. We covered school board meetings, high school football, the annual catfish fry. We wrote about the county fair, like it was a major world event because, to the people who still bought the paper, it was. We didn't have pull with state agencies. We didn't have a relationship with child services. And if we printed something accusatory without proof, we could get sued into the river. So I did what I always did when a letter made me uneasy. I put it in a folder. I told myself I'd follow up when there was time. Then I did something worse. I wrote a short community note piece. No names, no address, asking local charities and regional hospitals if they had resources for pediatric rehabilitation, especially for rural families. I made it sound like a general human interest angle. It ran on page 3, between a story about a church rummage sale and a photo of the mayor holding a giant check. I felt like I'd done something, like I'd moved the weight off my own chest. 2 days later, the phone started ringing. Not from hospitals, from strangers, people offering alternative care, People asking if the family would accept visitors. People saying they had treatment methods that could restore function. One man called 3 times and never gave his name. He just kept asking if the boy responded to stimulation. I sat there, staring at my desk, realizing what I'd done. I hadn't sent help toward a child. I'd lit a signal flare. I drove out to Briar Hollow the following week. I didn't bring a photographer. I didn't tell my editor exactly where I was going. I told him I was chasing a feature about rural health access. That part wasn't a lie. The lie was pretending that was the only reason. It took me longer than I expected to find the place. Because Briar Hollow wasn't really a town, so much as a collection of houses leaning into hills. Martha Keene's address led me to a single-story home with a sagging porch and a yard that looked too tidy to be empty. There were wind chimes hanging by the door. Not moving, no breeze, no sound. A hand-painted sign by the steps said, "Bless this home." I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, harder, and waited with my breath held, like I might hear something if I listened correctly. Still nothing. Then I noticed the mailbox. It was stuffed, but not with ordinary mail. Envelopes, handwritten, some with stamps from other states. More than a dozen. A lot for an elderly woman who could barely write one letter. I should have called someone right then. Instead, I did what I've spent years wishing I hadn't. I reached for the doorknob. It was unlocked. The air inside was cool, stale, and strangely clean. Not fresh. Not like lemon cleaner. Clean like a room that had been scrubbed of evidence. The living room looked staged. Couch. Afghans. Family photos turned face down on the mantel. I called out, just a simple hello, and heard my own voice die in the hallway. No reply. I moved deeper, slow and careful, feeling ridiculous and scared at the same time. A walker sat near the kitchen table. On the table, a teacup already set out, not dusty, not old, as if someone expected a guest. A newspaper clipping lay beside the cup. It was our page 3-piece. Someone had circled a line in red ink and written 2 words in the margin. Good. More. I stood there a long time, staring at that, my fingers numb around the clipping. Then I heard movement. Not footsteps. Not a person. Something softer, like fabric shifting or a small object being dragged. It came from the back of the house. I followed it down a hallway lined with closed doors. The last door had a new brass knob that didn't match anything else in the place. There were scratch marks around the lock, not deep gouges, not frantic, just repeated patient damage. I put my hand on the knob and stopped, because I realized something that made my stomach turn. The letter had invited me. The house was set for me, and I didn't know if I was the first. I backed away, quietly, out of the hallway, out of the living room, out onto the porch. I didn't run to my car like a hero in a movie. I walked like a man trying not to admit he was afraid. As soon as I was inside the car, doors locked, I called the sheriff's office in Briar Hollow. I told them I was a reporter. I told them I'd received a concerning letter. I told them the house was open and seemed abandoned, but not in a normal way. They promised they'd check. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station 2 miles away and waited, staring at my phone like it might change the outcome. When the call finally came, it wasn't the sheriff. It was a deputy. His voice was flat, careful, like he'd been trained to keep emotion out of public conversation. He asked me how I got inside. He asked if I touched anything. Then he told me to meet them back at the property. I drove in silence, my hands too tight on the wheel. When I arrived, there were 3 vehicles out front, and an ambulance parked crooked, like it had come in too fast. The deputy met me at the edge of the yard and didn't let me go up to the porch. He didn't tell me what they found. He didn't have to. I could see it in the way his eyes kept drifting toward the back of the house, like he couldn't stop looking at something even when he wanted to. And I could smell something faint on the air. Sharp, chemical, almost sweet. The kind of smell you don't forget once you've learned what it means. For the next few hours, I became invisible. I stood behind tape, behind uniforms, behind rules. They carried out bags. They photographed everything. They spoke in short phrases that didn't form a complete picture unless you already knew the language. Finally, a man in plain clothes approached me. Not a local cop. State. He asked to see the letter. I handed it over. He read it without expression, then flipped it and held it up to the light. That's when he found the first twist, one I'd missed completely. There were impressions on the back, indentations from words written on a sheet above it, like a carbon copy without the carbon. He told me they'd found other sheets inside the house with the same pattern. Different handwriting. Firm. Confident. Not the shaky scrawl of an elderly woman. He didn't show me those pages. He just said, "This wasn't written by her." Then he asked me a question that didn't make sense at first. "Did you publish anything after you got this?" My throat went dry. I told him about the page 3 note, trying to frame it like something harmless. The man's face changed, just a fraction, like he'd seen this kind of mistake before. He said, "That explains the mail." And he walked away before I could ask what he meant. They found Martha Keene in a back room, alive, but not present in the way a person should be. She kept trying to offer tea. She kept asking if I'd come to meet the boy. She kept patting the air beside her chair like someone was supposed to sit there. A paramedic told me she'd been heavily medicated. He didn't say with what. He didn't have to. In the room with the new brass knob, they found a bed. Not a child's bed. An adult-sized frame with rails. There were straps, unused, neatly arranged, like someone who believed in order had placed them carefully. They found bottles with labels that didn't come from any pharmacy in our county. They found notebooks full of measurements, not schoolwork, not doodles, measurements. And they found a boy. He was small, too small for his age. His head shaved, his skin pale, his eyes open, and unfocused like he was looking through the wall behind us. He did not cry. He did not speak. He didn't even look startled when strangers surrounded him. It was like he'd already learned that attention was always followed by something worse. A doctor later told me his injuries were complex, that the situation looked like unlicensed procedures done in stages, that certain things had been removed, others altered, that someone had been trying to change him, not to heal him, to reshape him. The deputy who first called me stood outside afterward and vomited into the grass. I didn't. I just stood there, staring at my own hands, thinking about how many times I told myself I didn't have power, thinking about how often I'd used that as permission to do nothing. They never found Calvin. They never found the guardian who'd supposedly dropped the boy off each day. They found a basement space nearby, not under Martha's house, but under a detached storm shelter behind a different property on the same road. It had lights strung up, a table bolted to the floor, a lock on the outside, and something that made my stomach go cold in a new way. A stack of newspapers, not just ours. Papers from surrounding counties, regional weeklies, free circulars, all open to the same thing. Human interest blurbs, community notes, small announcements about people needing help. Pinned to the wall were clippings like trophies. Each one had a name circled. Each one had a date. Not a date like a schedule. A date like a marker. Like someone saying, "This is when we noticed them." The state investigator told me later that they believed Martha was used as a door, a familiar face in a rural place, an innocent reason to come over, a way to move a child without drawing suspicion, and that my page 3 note, my harmless little attempt at help, had created a surge of attention that forced them to abandon the location. That's why the house felt staged. That's why the photos were turned face down. That's why the teacup had been set out like a prop. They weren't hiding from law enforcement. They were hiding from people like me, people who might accidentally shine light in the wrong direction. The Register never printed a story about it. We were told, bluntly, to keep our mouths shut. For the boy's privacy, they said. For an active investigation, they said. For the greater good, they said. I believed them. Or maybe I just wanted an excuse to stop thinking about it. I quit within a month. I moved north, found work doing anything that didn't involve community mail. I told myself I'd escape the feeling, that heaviness, that sense of having walked into the edge of something I wasn't built to understand. But the letter came with me, not the original. They kept that. A photocopy I'd made before handing it over, because some part of me still thought like a reporter. I kept it folded in a folder, inside a box I didn't open often. Then, years later, I got another envelope. No return address. My name written carefully. Inside was our page 3 clipping again, the one with the red circle. On the back, in firmer handwriting, someone had added a sentence. We liked what you did. I called the state investigator I still had a number for. He didn't answer. I called again. A woman picked up and told me that unit didn't exist anymore, that the case was reassigned, that she couldn't help me. Then, like she realized she'd said too much, she asked me something that made my skin go tight. Who told you to call here? I hung up without answering. Here's the last twist. The part I didn't understand until I tried to get rid of that photocopy. I burned it in a metal trash can behind my apartment, watching the paper curl, blacken, and crumble. I watched the gauze strip. Yes, I'd kept a piece of it because I'm not proud and I'm not brave. Shrivel and disappear. I told myself it was over, that if I destroyed the artifact, I destroyed the thread. The next morning, when I checked my mailbox, there was an envelope waiting. No stamp, no postmark, just my name. Inside was a fresh copy of the same letter. Same trembly handwriting, same polite opening, same invitation for tea. But this time, the return address wasn't Briar Hollow. It was an address 2 blocks from where I live now, and the name at the bottom wasn't Martha Keene. It was the name of a woman I'd never met, a name I later saw printed in the local paper under a small note about recovering from a medical episode, with neighbors thanked for their kindness. A note I would have skimmed right past. A note you would have skimmed right past. I'm telling you this because it doesn't end with arrests and closure. It doesn't end with a neat headline. It ends the way it started. With paper. With a polite request. With a problem small enough to ignore. Somebody out there learned that the easiest way to hide something monstrous is to wrap it in need. To make it look like caregiving. To make it look like community. To make it look like a good deed. And if you're listening to this now, I want you to do one thing after this video ends. Go check your mail. Check the flyers on your apartment lobby table, the notes on your neighborhood app, the community board at the coffee shop. Look for the messages that sound harmless. Look for the ones asking for help. Because the truth is, the letter isn't looking for a newspaper anymore. It doesn't need ink. It needs a reader. And now that you've heard this, you've already proven you'll pay attention long enough to finish. That's what they're counting on. That's what it counts as.